this world's only hope. I believe in all of us.
Dragon Age the Veilguard is one of the games that I've been looking forward to the most this whole entire year, despite the fact that I've never actually played Dragon Age Origins or Dragon Age 2. I own them, clearly, but they're sitting over there in my collection waiting for the rainy day that I decide to play them. Actually, if I'm being honest, I've never really played any of the classic BioWare games. I've dabbled in Knights of the Old Republic, but again, I never played the OG Dragon Age games, and I've never played the Mass Effect trilogy either. But I have played Dragon Age Inquisition. I absolutely love this game. In fact, this game holds quite a bit of sentimental value to me because it's the first epic fantasy video game I ever played and fell in love with. So much so it opened my eyes to the whole fantasy RPG genre, a genre that I never gave the time of day before. Actually, I'm gonna go even deeper than that. I started playing this game the same month that I watched Game of Thrones for the first time. And if you know me, you know I love Game of Thrones. It's my favorite fictional universe of all time. So experiencing those two things side by side at the same time in the same month turned me into a hardcore fantasy fan. And because of that reason, again, I was hyped as hell to play this game. But anyway, with all that being said, Dragon Age the Veilguard finally came out after almost a decade since the last game. And I've been playing it. I've been playing it a lot, which means I have a lot of thoughts that I want to share with you guys. So I'm going to jump into the review. I'm going to show you guys some raw gameplay. But before I do that, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, if you're new here. I talk about video games all the time on this channel. I do day one reviews, other video game discussions, that sort of thing. But enough with this introduction, let's talk about Dragon Age the Veilguard.
Take your
So first things first, before I share all my thoughts with you guys, keep in mind, I have not beaten the game yet. I've sunk quite a few hours in already, but still, I'm in the midst of the adventure, so consider this to be more of a first impressions review. And also, I'm going to keep this review as spoiler-free as possible. I'll talk about the story a little bit, but besides the basic setup, I'll avoid any specific details, and all of the gameplay that you're going to see is from the first 8 to 10 hours of the game, and I believe the first 4 main locations that you visit. And that probably sounds like a lot, but trust me, when it comes to this game, that barely scratches the surface. But with all that being said, what kind of game is Dragon Age the Veilguard? I'm sure most of you watching this already know the answer to that, but I do know that it's been 10 years since the last installment of the Dragon Age franchise, so there's quite a few new players as well. Plus, every Dragon Age game is very different from the one that came before it, and if you're like me and you've only played Inquisition before this one, let me tell you, you're in for a very different game. But anyway, much like the other Dragon Age games, Dragon Age the Veilguard is an epic fantasy action-adventure RPG. You create your own character, and you play through a sprawling main narrative. The game is incredibly story and character-driven, but of course it also has its fair share of side quests, optional places to explore, and a lot of choices you'll be forced to make that'll have an impact within the story and for each individual character. But one of the main differences between Dragon Age the Veilguard and most epic fantasy RPGs, at least the ones that I've played, is that this one is not open world. And for me, personally, that was one of the biggest hurdles that I had to overcome when it came to me fully enjoying this game. Don't get me wrong, I'm not one of those dudes that wants every single game to be open world. I've said this before, but I'll say it again. Most of my all-time favorite games are linear. I have nothing against linear games at all, but for some reason, and I know this is just a me problem, it's hard for me to accept and embrace when a franchise is big, but decides to go smaller, especially when my introduction to the franchise is a big game. For example, the first Final Fantasy game I ever played was Final Fantasy 15. It was a decently sized world that gave me a lot of freedom, or at least the feeling of freedom, and I was hyped as hell to play Final Fantasy 16, but it was so insanely linear that I just couldn't get into it. Again, I like linear games just as much as I like open world games, but I really don't like when a game is so linear that it feels like you're just walking in straight lines, like the map at any given moment is just a tunnel or a hallway, and if you're lucky, there might be a circle in the middle of that hallway where a battle will happen. I hate games like that, but I apologize for my side tangent on linear games, but my point is, I was worried that Veilguard was going to be the same way. It was already at a disadvantage when it came to how much I'd like it, due to the fact that it was reported that the game was going to be mostly linear, and Dragon Age Inquisition was the first huge fantasy game that I ever got into. And I know there's probably more than a few of you right now about to type in the comments that Inquisition is not an open world game, but I think you get my point. It's got a lot of large open areas, one of which is larger than some games' full map, and they're filled with story quests and side quests and cool places to explore and just random shit to find. The game feels huge, and it feels like it has an epic scope. And that's what I want. Just look at these books. They're huge. They're thick with like 3 C's. I want the fantasy content that I consume to feel as huge as possible. And I gotta be honest, when I first started playing Veilguard, for the first 4 to 5 hours, the more linear aspect did not work for me. It felt limiting, and it felt like the game just wanted to be a lot larger than it is, like it was being held back on purpose for no real reason. I had a hard time understanding the creative decision behind making it smaller, because almost every aspect of this game felt like it would have been way better if amped up to a larger scale. At least that's how I felt at first. But I'm happy to say that I did end up breaking past that mental blockade. I did so by repeatedly reminding myself that, as far as I'm aware, BioWare doesn't really make open world, huge scale games pretty much ever. From what I've seen and from what I've been told, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic isn't an open world game. It's a very linear experience for the most part, but with a huge sense of freedom built into its game's design. Same with the original Dragon Age and the original Mass Effect trilogy. In fact, my introduction to BioWare with Dragon Age Inquisition is actually the outlier. That game is actually the odd man out. So I told myself to just kind of sit back and embrace a game that was seemingly more in line with BioWare's roots. But also, again, after the 4 to 5 hour mark, I started to realize that I actually really like the linear level structure here. It wasn't too linear, which is what I feared. It didn't feel like I was walking down narrow pathways 24/7. The design actually reminded me a lot of the 2018 God of War game. If I had to wager money, I'd bet they used that game as their core inspiration for this game, much like God of War 2018. Dragon Age the Veilguard does a great job at feeling like you're in a huge world, even if you technically aren't. Most of the main story quests are very linear, bringing you from point A to point B, but you don't just walk in a straight line to do so. Sometimes there's shortcuts you need to find, or small environment puzzles to solve. Sometimes you need to backtrack, or you and your party get rerouted or detoured. Again, even though most of the main story quests are linear, they do a great job at making you feel like they're not too predictable, and that you're still partaking on an actual journey. And much like God of War Ragnarok, the whole game isn't entirely linear either. Quite often you'll come across places that are a bit more open. Nothing as large as, say, the hinterlands from Inquisition, but regardless, they do help make the game feel more fleshed out and real and more lived in. You can often revisit these places whenever you want to and do whatever side quests or side activities they have. But yeah, anyway, I'm just happy that despite the fact the game is on a much smaller scale than Inquisition, it still feels grand and it still feels fun to play. And the linear level design feels good, unlike other games like Final Fantasy 16 again, where the level design for me was pretty bad, which sucks because I loved mostly everything else about that game.
That one!
Let's go again.
Great hit, Rook.
Well, that's
Now let's talk about the combat. Once again, I'm happy to say that I like it a lot, which is good because this is a very action-heavy game. When it comes to the moment-to-moment combat, it's way more intense and way more fast-paced than Inquisition, at least from what I remember. I chose a rogue for my first playthrough. I didn't do too much research beforehand. I just chose the class that looked like it had the most entertaining moment-to-moment gameplay. But also, I never play as a rogue during my first playthrough of anything. 7 out of 10 times I go for a mage or a wizard or whatever the magic dude is. And the other 3 out of 10 times I tend to go for the standard knight or warrior, whatever guy has the shiniest armor and the coolest sword. But as a rogue, you dual wield swords and sabers, but you also have a bow and arrow as well, and you can constantly swap between the two, which I think is pretty cool. It's super fun slicing and dicing with your dual blades, then immediately swapping over to a bow for long range to finish off a boss when you're low on health or to take out some smaller enemies in the distance. In most games, you usually have to choose one or the other if you're a rogue, either blades or a bow. Sometimes, at the very least, you can carry both, but you need to manually swap during combat, like in ESO, for example. But anyway, like a lot of games in this genre, you get XP, which levels you up, and as you level up, you can unlock more skills and talents, some passive, but most active. Like, for example, some of the early skills you unlock as a rogue is the ability to send out this, like, shockwave thing that deals massive damage, and also the ability to shoot an arrow into the sky, and for some reason that causes a whole storm of arrows to fall down for 10 or so seconds. It's good crowd control, and pretty much every video game that has a character with a bow has some version of this skill. And that's only 2 of the early skills. The skill tree is absolutely massive, which is what I like to see. The more freedom of choice, the better. I always get a bit disappointed when I start a new RPG game and the skill tree is either 1, super small and offers no choice, or 2, you can unlock everything wicked fast, which makes combat super stale after a while. But luckily, that's not the case here at all, and that's not even mentioning the specializations. Each class had 3 specializations you can unlock after you reach level 20, which open up even more unique playstyles, but I'm not going to get too in-depth with the specializations here because I've barely had the time to play around with them. But everything I just mentioned is repeated twice over with both other classes, the warrior and the mage. So with that being said, when it comes to combat and combat only, Dragon Age the Veilguard has some of the most varied options I've seen in a long time, especially when it comes to a big budget AAA RPG made by a big studio. So many that were hyped up fell pretty short in the combat department, like Hogwarts Legacy and Starfield, 2 games I really like, by the way, but neither of those felt fully free when it came to the combat options, at least in my opinion, especially Starfield. But combat doesn't just end with you and your character, but your companions also partake in combat as well. They'll be bloodying their swords right alongside you. And when it comes to your companions in this game and how they're involved with the combat, I'm pretty mixed. I think it was a really bad move to not allow us to play as our companions this time around. That was probably my favorite feature of Dragon Age Inquisition, being able to swap between everyone in my party, not only in combat sections, but while exploring too. And for some reason, they decided to strip that from this game, and it really sucks. But when judging this game within its own merits, it's still decent, I guess. And I'm going to compare this game once again to God of War 2018 and God of War Ragnarok. The way you utilize your companions is essentially the same way you utilize Atreus in those games in the combat sections. They'll attack on their own and help you out on their own, but for them to actually make a real difference on the battlefield, you'll tell them to use specific skills on specific targets. You can do so through a menu that slows down time and lets you think and breathe, or you can do so through a quick menu while the combat keeps on rolling. Much like yourself, you'll be leveling up your companions. They'll get their own skill points, and you can unlock new abilities for them. You can also have them equip new weapons and gear, that sort of thing. I'm sorry if I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but I want to go back to my God of War comparison. The level design and the combat do remind me so much of God of War 2018, and I know that game was highly influential. There have been so many games since then that were clearly inspired by it, but all the ones that I've personally played were poor imitations that failed to live up to what made that game so good in a gameplay sense. Like, for example, a game I reviewed earlier this year, Banisher's Ghosts of New Eden. I liked that game for the most part. I thought it was pretty solid, but when it came to the combat and the level design, it was, again, a cheap imitation. And that's just one example, but Dragon Age the Veilguard, in my opinion, is the first game that I've played since 2018 that feels like it deserves being in the same conversation. It's clearly inspired, but it does a lot of its own things as well. And everything it does well enough that I would feel comfortable recommending this game to someone that said to me, I loved God of War 2018, recommend me something similar. Now, don't get me wrong, that's not me saying this game is as good as God of War. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying when it comes to the combat and the level design, it's the first game that I've played that's similar enough and good enough to be in the same realm of conversation. Kind of like Alan Wake 2 and the Resident Evil remakes. So many modern survival horror games are undoubtedly inspired by the Resident Evil 2 remake, and a lot of those horror games aren't as good, obviously. Like Daymare, for example. I'm not saying that game is bad. I know that game has its fans, but I don't think anyone would unironically say it's in the same league as Resident Evil 2, but Alan Wake 2, on the other hand, is a game that was also a product of the Resident Evil remake craze, but is good enough in its own right to stand out and stand alongside the RE games. And that's how I feel about Veilguard when comparing it to God of War. Again though, only when it comes to the core gameplay and the level design. But anyways, let's talk about the story, because when it comes to epic fantasy RPGs, to a lot of people, the story is the most important part, especially with BioWare games. People love this world, people love the characters in these games, and again, more importantly, people love the stories that's being told in them. And when a game is long, and this game is long, you want the narrative thread that connects everything to be interesting. You want to feel like you're invested. You want to feel like you have a real good reason to spend all these hours playing this one game.
Hey, Chuckles. Hope I'm not interrupting.
Let's buy him some time.
Again, I know I've said this like 3 times now, but I have not beaten the game yet. I'm sure there's a lot of the narrative beats I've yet to experience, so all this is just my thoughts on what I've witnessed so far. And once again, I'm going to avoid spoilers as best I can, but I find the main narrative to be pretty engaging so far, honestly. The story starts off with you hunting down Solus alongside Varric and Harding, and you quickly find him as he's trying to perform some sort of ritual that'll have life-changing effects for a lot of people. You manage to stop him, but by doing so, you end up unleashing 2 very powerful elven gods into the world, and they don't seem to be too friendly. Then after that, much of the early game has you going all over the region, trying to recruit new companions to help you try and defeat the 2 elven gods. That's the main plot, at least in the beginning of the game, and again, I'm finding it to be pretty compelling so far. I feel like the stakes are high. I feel the tension. I feel most of the characters have believable motivations. I also really like that the story is deeply tied into what I remember from Inquisition. Again, even though I loved Inquisition, I never played the expansions for it. And not only that, but I've also never read any story breakdowns or watched any videos that went over the story of those expansions. And I know those expansions pretty much directly set up the story here, but still, this game does a good job at making me feel like I'm not missing too much. I still feel like I understand most of what's happening and why it's happening, but with that being said, I unfortunately don't have much good to say about the smaller moment-to-moment stories that are being told. I like the bigger story threads, but the smaller stuff that happens in between has yet to really hook me, and that sucks because you're doing the smaller stuff more often, especially in the early game. So for example, you often go to new regions to recruit new people, and I like that part. I like finding new people and getting them to come back with me so we can go kill elven gods together. That part is cool, but when you find them, they're often entangled in their own personal story, and you help them out, and their stories are often smaller and more intimate, but connected in some way to the overarching narrative, which I like, but still, they're just kind of boring. More often than not, when I would take a break from a mission for 30 minutes or so, I would have to reread the quest description to remember what exactly it is I'm doing and why I'm doing it. Hopefully it gets better as the game goes on, but that now brings me to probably my biggest critique with the game so far, and that's the companions. And I know I already talked about how they worked in combat, but now I want to talk about them, their actual characters. So far, I don't find any of the companions to be interesting, pretty much at all, and half of them are just downright annoying, if I'm being honest with you, which sucks, because again, I loved pretty much every companion in Inquisition. I loved mixing up who was in my party and who I spoke to. I loved going out of my way between every single mission to see if there were any new dialogue options with them, but so far that's just not the case here. Everyone sounds so bored and disinterested, and I kind of dread it when I have to go out of my way to speak to them. It has nothing to do with their designs or their voice acting or their combat abilities or anything like that. It's just that the writing for them is so bland, and again, it really sucks. It makes it so I don't really care about them or their personal stories and quests, which is a big part of this game that I want to feel more invested in, but I just don't. See, just watch this cutscene for 1 second.
You're back, and you're alive. Good.
Sounds like things have gotten a lot worse since we left.
Darkspawn. They're showing up all over Arlethan, attacking anyone in their path.
We've evacuated 3 daily settlements already.
We ran into darkspawn too, near the Nodus Dirthalin.
Wait, you found the Nodus Dirthalin? The archive spirit? We could ask it about the gods. Figure out their next move.
See what I mean? It's not bad, it's just bland. There's not a single unique or cool thing about 90% of these characters. I feel like if you just closed your eyes and listened to that conversation without looking at it, you'd think that conversation and those characters could have been from anything. They talk and act like characters from every Netflix show, every Disney Plus show, every Apple TV show you see advertised everywhere that you would never actually watch. There's just a dangerous lack of personality and originality and soul when it comes to the companions in Dragon Age the Veilguard, and it definitely is the aspect of the game I'm the most disappointed with so far. But who knows? Maybe that'll change when I hit hour 30 or something. I'm not counting on it, but maybe.
Is that suit of armor moving?
Gotcha.
Now I'm just going to rapid fire through some more of my thoughts, things I want to mention, but I don't necessarily have a whole lot to talk about. The first being the world. For the most part, I really like it, especially the art design. I have a feeling I'm probably in the minority here, but I really, really like the visuals of this game. I'm a big fan of the half realistic, half stylized look. I think it matches the tone, the vibe, and the world really, really well. And the color palettes they chose I find really appealing. I'm a big fan of deep purples and deep pinks, and I think it pairs really well with the darker blues and the bleaker tone of a lot of these locations, and I just find this world to be really pretty to look at. Also, this game has one of the best character creators I've seen in a game myself, and when you finish customizing a character, they actually look like that in the game afterwards. I remember when I first started Starfield, I spent a long time making my dude, but then when I actually loaded into the game, he looked nothing like he did in the customization menu. He was like the Temu version, and that's not the case here. My character looks in-game how she looked when I customized her, and I love that. Also, your custom characters look really natural in cutscenes. Oftentimes in games like this, there's a dramatic difference between how NPCs look and how your character looks, and obviously your companions are going to look better than you, but honestly, not by much, and that was really cool to see. Another critique I have with the game, though, is that for some reason, so many of the smaller elements feel like a live service game, which I do not like at all, and I'm a fan of a lot of live service games, by the way, full transparency, but I don't want that stuff anywhere near Dragon Age. Don't get me wrong, though, this is not a live service game, not at all. It's a single player experience through and through, but again, for some reason, the way certain things are designed don't feel that way. Like the way you randomly find resources laying around the map, they're not in organic or believable locations. I've found stacks of wood behind the bar in a tavern before. It just feels weird, and it does kill a little bit of the immersion. Same with the way chests and loot work. Your character doesn't just open a chest and pull stuff out of it. They kick it open in a dramatic fashion, and the contents fly into the air, and you catch it in this big song and dance display. It feels so much like how you collect loot in mobile games, and it just doesn't fit in here. Also, chests aren't in organic places either. It's not like you find chests like behind waterfalls or behind thrones or somewhere where they would feel believable to be. Chests just appear in front of you after you do stuff. I don't like that. Same with the way armor and weapon upgrades work. Of course, you can just use resources to level stuff up, but there's also this mechanic where if you find or buy something you already have, they'll merge into one and be more powerful. That's just the kind of thing I don't really see in single player games, but I've seen that in a lot of live service games. But yeah, as you can tell, on paper, my thoughts are very, very mixed. There are so many aspects with this game that are a noticeable step down when you compare it to Dragon Age Inquisition. The story, the characters, the companions, customization, armor customization, weapon customization, the world, how big it feels, the actual maps that you explore. And a lot of this game so far is disappointing, I'm not going to lie to you, but I would be lying to you if I said that despite all of that, that Dragon Age the Veilguard wasn't still one of the most fun games that I've played all year. When it comes to just the pure fun factor, the entertainment value, this is one of my favorite games of the year. I think this is one of those games that's going to be picked through with a fine-tooth comb right now. Everyone is going to highlight the flaws, and I'm not saying that's wrong for people to do, but that's what people do with new releases. They talk about the flaws more than they talk about what's good with it, especially if it's a game that has a lot of both, like this. But I think, give it a few years, I think people are going to look back on this game a lot more fondly, especially when you judge it for what it is on its own instead of the context of the franchise that it's a part of. But yeah, that's my thoughts on Dragon Age the Veilguard so far. Have you played it? If you have, let me know what you're thinking about it in the comments down below. And if you haven't, let me know, do you plan to, or are you going to skip it completely? Either way, I look forward to hearing your thoughts down below. Depending on how this video performs, I'll make a follow-up after I beat the game, and I'll give you guys another half hour of me rambling. But anyway, once again, consider subscribing if you haven't already, and thank you for watching, especially if you watched this far.
I don't usually see elven ruins that haven't been picked over.
Not many people come this far into Arlethan. Just veil jumpers, mostly.
People trying to save the world, apparently.